Well, good evening, everybody. Um, so tonight I'm going to be talking about managing poor performance. And I thought I would just start off with kind of two quick polling questions. Remember, as you answer these, by the way, that I can't see what you individually said. All I see is the aggregate results. But let me start. Let me start with this one. So we've got a poll up here, and just want to see how many of you have ever had to fire somebody. And we'll see what our responses turn out to be here. Just wait one more minute and then we'll move forward. Give it about 10 more seconds and then we'll move on. So as a group, you've been pretty lucky. Sounds like you've not had to fire people very much. At some point in your life, you will. It's almost certain. It's very rare to go a long time as a manager without having to do that. First time it happened to me, I was, I think, in my late 20s, maybe about 28 or something like that. And I had no clue what I was doing. I had never received any kind of training in how to do it. And I made a lot of kind of classic rookie mistakes. And of course, your goal in managing poor performance is not to fire somebody, but that is the worst case outcome for them and for you. Although in the long run, it often turns out to be not a bad outcome. In the long run, it often turns out to be better for them and better for you. So let me just do one other quick poll here, and then we'll move on. What happened with that here? It's here. So this is my next question, and just want to see if any of you have ever received any kind of formal training, whether it happened in a class or at work, about how to manage poor performance. As I said, when this first confronted me, and first confronted me, I was probably in my mid-20s. By the time I had to fire somebody, I was probably, I don't know, 28 or something. But I had never received any training at all. And it looks like as a group here, most of you have received some training. And that's really good, very encouraging. And be interesting if you hear anything this evening where you disagree, and you might want to share your own thoughts, and simply just unmute yourself and jump in anytime you want. That'd be totally fine. So almost everybody has received at least some kind of training about this. Now, I've got some videos on Canvas that are beyond this set of PowerPoint slides I'm going to be talking about this evening. Some of those introduce you to managing poor performance. They introduce the concept of that in the United States, at least, the kind of the pre-existing rule, unless there's a contract that says otherwise, is that employees can, either party actually, can terminate the employment relationship for any reason and without notice. It's quite striking. Something that's not true in other parts of the world, especially in Europe and in a number of sophisticated economies in Asia. But in the U.S., that's kind of the basic assumption. That assumption might not hold true if you are working under a contract. For example, if you're a union employee, then the union contract specifies the conditions under which somebody can terminate a relationship. And the same is true if you are an individual, which is uncommon, and you have your own individual contract, something usually that executives have. It also talks a little bit about the origins of what's referred to as progressive discipline, and how progressive discipline grew out of the successful union movements in the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1950s. And it was a common thing that unions would negotiate for to basically say, listen, as part of our contract, we're going to say you can't fire somebody right away. First, you'd have to give them some kind of progressive form of discipline, perhaps a verbal reminder or a verbal warning. And if that doesn't work, then maybe a written reminder or a written warning. And if that doesn't work, then perhaps a suspension, or at the very least, some kind of final notice before somebody would actually be fired. So some of those videos cover that ground. Another video there kind of goes over the basics of giving effective negative feedback. So we're just going to focus on how to have these conversations with difficult employees who are not performing effectively. With that said, I'll tell you that not all of this stuff, but a bunch of this stuff comes from a book that this is the earliest version of it, which is like 20 plus years old, although there have been a number of editions since then, written by a guy named Dick Brody, called Discipline Without Punishment. It's actually just kind of written as a popular book about management, and has lots of really good tips about how to deal with poor performance. So my starting point is to say, look, you can't do anything when you're dealing with a performance problem until you have some evidence about what the cause of it might be. Some people are performing poorly, but it's because they lack the resources or the support needed to perform well. They don't have the time. They don't have the resources. They don't have the information they need. Others are performing poorly because they really don't understand the expectations. They just don't get it. There hasn't been clear, specific goal setting. And so they really don't understand the expectations, and they kind of make it up as they go along. Some just lack the knowledge or skill. They want to do well. They just don't have the skill. They don't have the formal training, or they're in a job where they're a bit over their head. So sometimes that would obviously lead to a very different approach, which would include training or coaching. But in the most difficult circumstances, at least in my experience, people have the resources, they have the support, they understand the expectations, they have the knowledge, but they're simply not doing what you need them to do. That is to say, there's kind of a failure to execute. And unfortunately, a lot of problems occur there. And the reason why I use the term unfortunately is just because, look at, if the expectations are unclear, that's a pretty easy fix. If people lack resources or support, well, you can provide them support. You might not be able to provide them with all the resources needed, but you can provide them with support. If they lack knowledge or skill, you can take care of that by providing training or coaching, or at the least, changing the standards that you use to hire people. But when people seem to have all the tools to succeed and they're not, and they're failing to execute, now we've got a problem. So this is kind of a general guide for the kind of discussions you might have on addressing performance problems. And I want to describe 3 phases here. Some things you ought to do before you sit down and talk to somebody. Don't just sit down and talk to them. Let's have a systematic approach to preparing for that meeting. Secondly, we'll talk about how you actually have the conversation. And then third, we'll talk a bit about what you do after the conversation. And you'll see that this week's assignment is grounded around that 3-phase approach. So before we meet, we often say it's really useful to determine what's the category of the problem. Some problems are about attendance or lateness. Those are by far the easiest to deal with, just because the facts are so objective. Some are conduct problems, and by conduct problems, I mean somebody's doing something that's really a violation of basic expectations and civility in the workplace. I was once working someplace. I wasn't involved with these 2 people, but 2 people in a lunchroom got into an argument. And one of them picked up a chair and literally threw it at somebody. So that's a conduct problem. And again, they're usually they're difficult, but at least it's objective. It's easy to determine what's going on. Performance problems are often tougher again because the performance problems get into this issue of knowledge, skill, effort. What's going on here? Try to focus on one problem at a time, not multiple problems. And that's an easy thing to say, and everybody goes, oh, yeah, I know that. But in real life, most of us don't do that because when one problem occurs, we're thinking, well, there hasn't been a problem with this person before, and so let's kind of let this go. Maybe it was just a bad incident. Everybody has a bad day. We'll let it go. And then nothing happens for 6 weeks, and you're thinking, things are fine. And then something happens again, but it's not all that serious. You're a little worried, but it's not all that serious. So you go, if I have a chance, I'll try to talk to him in the next couple of days. But you don't get around to it. And then again, 3 or 4 weeks later, something else happens, and now you're going to talk to them, and suddenly you have 3 things to talk to them about. And there might be 3 different problems. But bottom line is you want to try to talk to them as quickly as you can and try to focus on one problem for discussion. Next thing you want to do, and I always encourage people to write this down. Literally write it down. Make 2 columns. One column is headed actual performance, and the other is headed expected performance. And what you want to do is side by side, just for your own reference, write down, here's what actually happened, as specifically as you can. You can't use vague things like, oh, you got a bad attitude. I have a whole little video on that you can watch. Never tell somebody they have a bad attitude. Even if you think they do, don't say it. Focus on behavior. So write down the actual behaviors that you've observed, and right next to that, write down, what did you expect? What would you expect? So if there are 2 or 3 behaviors that you've seen that are disappointing or a problem, write down each one, and right next to that, in the other column, write down what you would have expected. This is how it should have been happening, how it should have been handled. So get your facts straight. Actual behavior versus expected. So these are incredibly trivial examples. An example of an expected performance might be that employees are supposed to only smoke in designated areas outside of the building, but the actual behavior was that somebody saw Jim smoking in the cafeteria. It could be literally that simple. Or another example is that you're expected to respond courteously to customer questions, and an actual performance was that one of the bank tellers was overheard saying, "That's a pretty ridiculous question, isn't it?" Actually saying that to the customer. And by the way, you might think I made that up. I didn't make it up. I was doing some coaching with some banks a number of years ago, and one of the branch managers told me that story. Wow. Next thing before the meeting is and write this down. What's the business reason why this needs to be solved? I presume you wouldn't be having this conversation unless there was some business reason that said this needs to be solved. I mean, imagine that the employee winds up saying to you, "I don't see why this is a problem." What difference does it make? Well, you ought to have an answer to that. You ought to be, in advance, you ought to have thought, what would I say if somebody said that? Why does this matter? What's the good business reason why this needs to be solved? Another thing to be thinking about is to just, sometimes it helps to think about the worst case scenario. So what's the worst case scenario? More often than not, if you talk to somebody, things are going to get better. But imagine they don't. Or imagine the person says, well, I'll try, but I can't guarantee it's going to get better. Well, what would be the consequences of that? You would have thought a little bit about that before you have the conversation. Not so you can threaten the person, but because if the conversation kind of goes down the wrong path, you can be clear about what the consequences might be. And I don't mean that all the consequences are firing somebody, right? Sometimes somebody gets more supervised more closely, or they get less desirable work, or they don't get a salary increase, or you move them into a formal discipline process where they get a verbal reminder or a written reminder. And then finally, before you meet with the person, last thing to jot down is what could happen? What are some action steps that the employee could take, or that the 2 of you could take, sometimes you're involved, in order to handle this situation and make things better? So you ought to have all those things kind of thought through and jot it down on a piece of paper. Not to share with the person that piece of paper, but for you to be able to keep track of things and to be able to stay on top of what the meeting agenda is. Now, the next question often becomes, well, what next? Where do we meet? When do we meet? Now, I say, first of all, the biggest single thing, and I think you all know this, right, of course, about where to meet, is that you need to meet someplace where you're guaranteed privacy. Other people aren't going to be able to overhear you. That might be your office, if your office is like that. It could be a private space that's quiet, like a conference room. When? Don't rush the meeting. Make sure you've got your facts straight. Make sure you're prepared. If you're going to do a more formal disciplinary action, then you ought to make sure that you have approval, that your boss knows about this, and that you've maybe spoken to an HR representative who knows about the company's policies. By the way, one other thing about when is never, ever have this conversation while you're angry. All of us who've had conversations when we're angry know that it virtually never goes well. This is true not only at work, but it's true with a partner, with a spouse, with a friend, with a child, with a parent. It just doesn't work. So make sure you're calm. That means you might have to take some time. That's okay. How? What's the how? Well, look at it. If it's a minor kind of conversation, and you don't want to have this as a big disciplinary thing, you want to kind of start off with kind of a coaching approach. Then kind of get out from behind your desk, kind of sit side by side with the person, adopt kind of a casual kind of body language and posture. But imagine this is a very serious incident, or imagine this is a recurring problem. Well, now you want to do something different. You want to be on one side of a desk or one side of a table, and the person's on the other side. You don't want to have anything else on the desk. No other papers, just your little note for yourself. So it looks like the entire focus of attention is on this. Have your posture be very firm and upright. All of these nonverbal kinds of things convey how serious it is. And so you need to keep in mind that your nonverbal behavior ought to be matching your goals for the meeting. Who should be present? The general rule is the more people who are present, the less effective the meeting is going to be. There are exceptions. I'll come back to them. But generally, it should just be you and the other person. Because when more managers are there, it makes the employee feel threatened. Or sometimes they'll try to play one person off against the other person. Now, are there times when you need to have two people there other than the employee? The answer is yeah. Sometimes that's specified, for example, in a union contract where a shop steward has to be there, a representative of the union. So you'll need to look at the contract to know that kind of thing. And in a very, very serious incident, you want to have perhaps another manager there to emphasize how big a deal this is. But that's very, very, very uncommon. Bottom line is, in the vast, vast, vast majority of circumstances, it's just the two of you. How long should the meeting be? One mistake I made is I used to have these really long meetings, talking to an employee for 45 minutes, 50 minutes. And it was like, oh my God, it's like we're having a therapy session here. This is crazy. The bottom line is it should be short, well-planned, and 20 minutes is reasonable. Sometimes you can do it much less than that. So that's typical. By the way, these rules don't apply to terminating a firing discussion. Those are handled in another video. I really encourage you to look at those. That's a really important skill to have. And firing conversations, termination conversations are completely different than these and much shorter. So how do you get started? Well, you want to get started by not saying something that is really threatening and makes the person defensive. But you also want to get to the point. Now, one thing people sometimes say is, well, shouldn't you start off with a positive note? And I think it depends. If you're never the kind of person who says something positive, and then you have created a problem. Because now the first time you're talking to somebody is when there's a problem, even though there have been lots of good things in the past. But a really good manager talks to people when things are positive all the time. They pause, they thank people, they express their appreciation, they compliment them. So they don't need to be doing that now. They can get to the point. So you got to do it in your own language. There's no script. I hate people who tell you, here's the script, use this. I don't like that. But the bottom line is kind of get there using your own language. So these are just a few examples, you know. First, I got a problem. I'm going to need your help. Or I'm dealing with a situation that's really been troubling me. It's really been bothering me. I think I'm going to need your help to get it resolved. So you're just saying something where two things are clear, right? One is that something is not the way it ought to be, and two, you're involved. You know? You haven't accused somebody of being a jerk or anything like that. That's not what you're trying to do. I've got a problem. I need your help. And then, so remember when you were preparing for the meeting, you had two columns. One said actual behavior. The other said expected behavior. That's what you're doing now. So you might say, hey, Chris, here's the thing that's been bothering me. Right or wrong, the company expects that we handle certain situations by doing X, Y, and Z, or J, K, and L. But in the last couple months, there have been 2 times when I've seen you do A, B, and C. So there's kind of a difference between what the expectations are, my expectations and the company's expectations, and what I've observed. And so that I'm very concerned about that. So right off the bat, just get to the point. Here's what actually happened. Here's what I expected. And then pause. Stop talking and pause and say, Chris, talk to me about it. You know, what can you tell me about it? What's been going on? Anything I don't know. Bring me up to date. What's going on? The goal here is for you to listen and to let the person talk. And sometimes, of course, the person, even though you're well prepared, they might tell you something that you didn't know. And now suddenly you're like, whoa, okay. Well, that turns the conversation in a slightly different direction. So let them talk. And as they talk, this ought to be a two-way conversation. But it's really important that you're listening at the beginning and they sense that you're listening, even if you're not buying their story. And then ultimately, you got to get to a point where you're going to gain the employee's agreement about how this kind of situation is going to get handled in the future. Okay? So whatever that means, and you know that varies from conversation to conversation. But here are some examples. You know, Bill, I need you to agree that you'll always respond to a customer inquiry within 2 days. Do I have your agreement that you'll do that, Bill? Because what you're searching for here ultimately is an agreement. And that agreement is something that flows out of your expectations and the company's expectations, the company's policies, and perhaps also out of the conversation that you just had with him. Another example here might be, listen, I need you to talk to me as soon as a problem comes up and a deadline is at risk. So, but ultimately, I need your agreement that we're going to meet those deadlines all the time. But I also know, look, things come up, so I need you to talk to me as soon as possible. So do I have your agreement that that's how you're going to handle it? Can you do that? You know, and maybe the person says, yeah, I guess so. It's not a very good response. So then say, what do you mean by that? You know, and what you're trying to do in the end is get to a point where you and the employee have agreed on the path forward. That's the basic goal of the conversation. If the problem continues, happens again 3 weeks later or 4 weeks later, I think you got two things to talk about. You have the new incident that you want to talk about, but you also want to remind the person that I had this conversation with you 4 weeks ago, and at that time you agreed you were going to do X, Y, Z, but since then you did J, K, and L and not X, Y, and Z. What's going on? A couple of tips here that might be important, and mistakes that I made, again, when I was young, which is why I like this advice. The burden of solving the problem ultimately has to rest with the employee. You can help. You can offer guidance, but never let them flip it around and put it all on you. Here are a couple examples of this. Um, One is, so the book I mentioned at the beginning calls the yeah but game, which is that the person agrees with you right away that there's a problem, but then they say yeah but but this. Yeah, I know I've been getting in late recently, and yeah, you're right. I was late on those 4 dates, 20, 25 minutes. But listen, here's the problem. And by the way, I totally get it. You're right. I really need to get her on time. But here's the problem I'm facing is my kids tend to stay up late because their dad doesn't get home from work until very late. And they want to be able to see their dad when their dad comes back from his late shift. And I think you can understand that. I can't imagine either one of us would disagree that kids ought to be able to see their dad. So what happens then is in the morning, the kids are very tired. And it's really hard to get them out of the house on time. And as I get them out of the house on time, it's almost impossible for me. By the time I do get them out of the house, then I'm running late and I get here 15 or 20 minutes late. I think you can see what's happening. And the worst mistake you can possibly make is to suggest a solution to that problem. You might say, well, have you tried this? Or have you thought about this? No, it's not your problem to fix. You can say, listen, boy, that sounds tough. That sounds like a difficult situation. So how are you planning on handling that so that you can get here on time every day? You're not offering the suggestion about how to solve it. It's their job to solve it. So that's one way to try to avoid the yeah but game. Another thing is to, and this has happened to me several times, and I'll bet you it may have happened to some of you, is when people try to direct you in another direction. So you wind up saying, well, the company expects X, Y, and Z. And then the employee winds up saying, I work someplace else, and for 2 years, and they handle these situations much better than things are handled here. Because here were their expectations, and here's the policy that they had in place. I just think it's much better than the way things are handled here. Don't take that bait. Don't take that bait. If you start debating how the previous boss handled it, how another company handled it, they're going to win. You can't win this argument. So you have to use a tactic called dismiss and redirect. And this is a perfect example of it. Look at, as far as how they handled situations like this in your previous company, maybe we'll talk about that someday. But right now, what I need you to do is to agree to get the reports in on time. Or I need you to agree to do X, Y, Z, whatever it is. Now, notice that you just didn't take the bait. You just said, look, it might be something we could talk about sometime. But right now, I need you to agree to X, Y, and Z. Always go back to what you need them to agree to. Always go back to the expectations. Don't take the bait about trying to justify why your company has this policy, but some other company had another policy, or the previous boss did things differently. Don't take that bait. Finally, you want to close the discussion. If it was a formal disciplinary discussion, a verbal warning or reminder, a written warning or reminder, then you need to say that to the employee. Just because you had a conversation with somebody and you warned them or reminded them doesn't mean it represented a verbal reminder or a verbal warning under the company's policy. You have to specify that that's the case. So you have to tell the employee what step is being taken, if any step is being taken. If it's just a coaching conversation, then when you're done, you're done. Finally, after the meeting, the biggest mistake I made is I must have met with this employee. That was the employee I ultimately wound up firing. And I was managing about 10 or 11 people at the time. And I must have met with this employee, I don't know how many times, because I never documented them. I didn't have any record of them. But I'll bet you it was 7 or 8 times. And it just never got better. And I was at a point where I thought, I'm going to have to fire this person. And I was talking to somebody else, a very senior person, about it. And they said, well, how many times have you talked to them? What were the dates? I had no idea. I didn't know the dates. I didn't know how many times. I hadn't documented things. It's crazy. Yeah? So rule number one, after the meeting, document it. Now, how do you document it is the question. And there are lots of ways to do that. So let's start with the most benign way to do it. This is a great employee. You had, there was a problem. You had a great conversation. You're feeling very confident that nothing is going to happen again. This situation is completely resolved. Still, how would you document that? Well, one classic approach these days is to send yourself an email. Literally just send it to you. Don't send it to the employee. Just send it to you saying, I met with Tony on the following date. Meeting started at this time, ended at this time. I clarified that these are the behaviors I saw. These are my expectations. Tony talked for a while. He said X, Y, and Z, or she said X, Y, and Z. Ultimately, Tony and I agreed that going forward, Tony's going to do, J, K, and L. And I think that's going to solve the problem. Send this off your email. That's great. And you might say, well, would that hold up in court? You're not interested in it holding up in court. You're interested in being able to document and recall exactly what happened. By the way, employment attorneys will tell you that they're generally delighted if you do something like that, even though it's not a formal documentation that you want to bring in front of a judge. They're just happy that there's some evidence and you sent it on a certain date. Your email system will capture that. Another approach, of course, is to send an email to the employee. A very nice email to the employee. Again, this is assuming things went well. Hey, Tony, thanks for taking the time to talk to me today. I know you're really busy. I really appreciate getting 15 minutes of your time. I mentioned, the company's expectations of X, Y, and Z, and that I had seen J, K, and L in the last few weeks. I thought we had a really good conversation about it. And I was really pleased that at the end, we both agreed, and you agreed, that from now on, you're going to handle that situation by doing, OP or whatever. And so that's great. I felt really good about that. And again, thanks for your time. And if you have any questions, please get in touch with me. Very appreciative. Thanks a lot, Tony. And the tone of that is very positive. It's thankful. It's expressing gratitude. It's also summarizing what happened in a quick and easy way without sounding threatening. And but of course, an underlying thing is that the person knows they got the email. So now you both have documentation of the meeting. Now, if you're going into some kind of formal disciplinary action, if you're a company that has oral reminders or oral warnings, my first advice is talk to somebody in HR who handles these kinds of things a lot. Not because you expect them to have the conversation. They shouldn't have the conversation at all. It's your job. But if you're going to have the conversation, somebody who deals with this kind of stuff in HR, they often know, oh yeah, this is typical of the kind of thing we'd give an oral reminder for. Or, most of the time in the company's past 5 years, here's how we've handled that. We haven't given an oral reminder. We started off by just having a conversation. Or they might even say to you, we think something more serious than an oral reminder ought to happen. Maybe we think a written reminder or a written warning is needed. Bottom line is, find somebody in HR who knows the history and how things have worked, because employment attorneys will shoot you if you do something that is not consistent with the way similar situations have been handled in the past. Now, with a written reminder or a written warning, there are a couple of things to think about. First, you always want to get an approval from somebody higher up, and preferably from somebody in HR, so they know this is happening. And again, it makes sure that this situation is being handled the way similar situations have been handled maybe in other parts of the company, which is something you probably don't know. But somebody higher up, and certainly somebody in HR, probably will. Another good piece of advice is to not prepare a written notice in advance. Literally, don't do it in advance. Just have the conversation structured exactly the way I've talked about it. Start off with expectations versus what actually happened. Let them talk, listen, have a conversation, and then kind of reach an agreement that you're completely comfortable with, 100% comfortable with, about how this is going to be handled in the future. When you're done with that, then you prepare the written warning, the written reminder. And these are examples of the kinds of things that might be contained in that. So you'd say, well, here in that written warning, written reminder, you might say, listen, we've met in the past on the following dates. On this date, we met and talked about X, and you said you would do Y. I was happy about that. Since then, you did K again. And so we had another conversation, and you might remember that occurred on this date. And at the end of that conversation, we agreed that we're going to do this. And I informed you that conversation constituted an oral reminder or an oral warning. And we talked again today, and I'm glad we had a chance to do that. And because we had yet another problem since our oral reminder conversation. Here was the nature of that problem. So listen, in our conversation today, I specified that the situation has to be corrected, not improved. It has to be corrected. That is to say, we agreed that these are the exact changes we need to see. Okay. And we really need to see you have acceptable performance in every part of your job. And I was delighted that you agreed to correct the problem. And after today's conversation, and that you're going to do JK&L. And I take it that you're a person of your word, and I'm glad about that. And I believe the situation will be corrected, and I'm hopeful that this is going to work out really well for you and for me and for the company. And put that in writing, and that's what the person gets. Send a copy to HR, keep a copy for yourself. So those are a couple of basic things. I'll close by saying some companies have, if a problem occurs after that, some companies consider an oral and a written enough progressive discipline to just say, if it happens again, we're going to terminate the person's employment. Some companies don't do that. There's actually some companies that use what they call a paid decision-making leave, which is I had never heard of it before, but there are a number of companies that do this. It's an interesting approach. What they do is they say to the person, all right, look, we've had an oral reminder on this date, written reminder on this date, and since then we had another problem. So here's the deal. Tomorrow, I don't want you to come into work. In fact, I want you to stay home, and I'm going to pay you. And the reason why I want you to stay home and I'm going to pay you is because I need you to make a decision. When you come back, not tomorrow, but the day after that, I need you to tell me either A, you're going to resign because you don't see any way that this situation can be saved and resolved, or B, you're completely 100% committed to resolving this situation. It will never happen again. And if the employee says, listen, I don't need a day off to do that. No. You say, I'm not saying you do, but I think it's so serious that you need to stay home and think about this. And then make a really well-informed decision. You let me know first thing when you come in the next morning, what are you going to do? Are you going to resign? Or are you going to be totally 100% committed to never having a problem again? So that's just called a paid decision-making leave. So some companies do that. Some companies don't. Some companies have a formal suspension. They just send you home for a day or two, and you don't get paid. That generally doesn't do a whole lot of good. It just makes the person angry, especially because they're not getting paid. So that's generally not a very helpful approach. Some people just have what's called a final warning. They just say, this is it. Any kind of problem at all after this, it's going to lead to termination. Usually, of course, by the time you're at that point, you're almost certain you're going to wind up terminating the employee. But I've seen times when somebody turned it around, so we can't guarantee that. Anyways, those are options. Those are the classic progressive discipline options. Again, not every employee has that. Remember, the general kind of common law principle in the United States is that somebody could be terminated for any reason at any time and without notice. Yeah? As long as it's not a reason that violates some other kind of law. An EEO law or something like that, or a whistleblower law or something like that. But you don't need a big reason to terminate somebody in the United States. I'm not arguing that's good policy because I think it can really tick people off. But you generally don't need progressive discipline unless your company has a policy of progressive discipline. So those are some of the key points here. And I always close by saying, because somebody says this, wow, this person went a year and a half without a problem. And then we had this kind of minor problem come up again. Now what? Well, it's a judgment call. There's no right or wrong here. It's a judgment call. It depends on how serious the problem was that just occurred, how long it was between the last problem and this new incident, this new event. And some companies have a policy that says, listen, if you can go X amount of time, we will literally deactivate the disciplinary action. We'll take it out of your record, so it won't be in your record. This is how long you need to go to get this off of your record. So some companies do that, and that's a good thing. It gives somebody something to work toward. Now, again, sometimes this all doesn't work, and we wind up at a point where we have to fire somebody. And again, the game about how to do that and how to prepare for it and how to have a conversation and who ought to be present and how long it takes, etc., is completely different than this. Completely different than this. And there's a video on Canvas about how to do that. But the one thing I will say, and some of you may know this, that a typical firing or termination discussion lasts about 5 minutes. Literally. I've witnessed dozens of them because I did employee relations work years ago when I worked at a casino in my early 30s. And I was a witness in termination discussions. I was always a witness, and I was the witness. So I heard a lot of these. They're very, very fast. So if you have questions about that, check out that video, and it might be worth knowing about. So as we wrap up today, I have one last thing I want to ask you to do, and it's one last poll, okay? So here's the next poll I want to do here. Okay. Yeah. So that's just a little feedback for me. Again, remember, I won't know who said what, but at least it gives me a feel for things. And I just want to get from people a sense as to whether or not you found this session to be useful or interesting. So if you can check off this poll here, that would be very helpful for me. Again, remember, I'm recording this. I will post it on Canvas so you can watch it again if you'd like to. Okay, well, that's very helpful. In general, the pattern is that about 85% of people found the session useful or interesting. One person was kind of neutral on the matter, and but nobody was disagreeing or strongly disagreeing with that, and that's good. And if you ever want to talk to me about a situation like this, please feel free to do so. I'm much more comfortable after having been through some of these earlier in my career, and I hope that you will avoid the difficulties that I had. I hope you have a great evening, a good week. This is our last Zoom session of the course, and I'll look forward to seeing your work. And I'm already starting to grade and have graded several of the skills analysis papers. So looking forward to getting all those things done. It'll probably take me 3 or 4 more days to do that. Have a good evening, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.